Before April closes out, let's go ahead and take a few minutes to acknowledge some of the anniversaries of great releases from death metal's history. But today we're going to look at just the 90s and see how that turns out for us. So these are albums, right, that according to Metalum, which is always correct. Okay, maybe not always. But according to Metalum, the original release date was in April in one of the years during the 90s. So I'll go through some of these different releases. What I'll show you won't necessarily be the original press. Some of these, too, maybe only originally came out on tape. But I will give them to you if they've at least had a CD pressing at some point. Since then, some kind of reissue. So some of what I'll show you are the original presses. Some are later presses. But let's go ahead and acknowledge these anniversaries and have some fun celebrating, this death metal thing. So let's start with 1990. Excruciate, Mutilation of the Past. Here's a raw, nasty, early Swedish death metal gem. In April 1990, it was only released on tape, but in 2016, Dark Symphonies put this phenomenal release on compact disc. The lineup on this includes members that would go on to play in Carbonized and Therion, among others. Next, we have Disharmonic Orchestra's Expositions Prophylax, or however you say that. The debut album by Austria's Disharmonic Orchestra was dropped by Nuclear Blast on CD, vinyl, and cassette. They started as a death grind band before putting out a couple of classic death metal albums and then going off into a very different musical direction later on. Also from Austria, we had the debut album by Pungent Stench. For God, Your Soul, For Me, Your Flesh. So there have been many pressings of this album with a number of different covers. This is the original cover from the Nuclear Blast release, but this is a later pressing. It's still as punky, fun, and gross as when it first came out. And on the back side here, this alternate artwork is what is often used as, the alternate artwork of some of the other pressings. Now let's move on to 1991, starting with a death thrash classic. So, Revenant's Prophecies of a Dying World. Death thrash albums don't get much better than this New Jersey classic. This was the debut full-length by Revenant, and sadly the only full-length album that they would ever release. Nuclear Blast was responsible for this one. Speaking of thrash, this is mostly just a death metal list here, but we've got a good brutal tech kind of thrash album from this same year that maybe we should acknowledge here in Invocator's Excursion Demise. This technical thrash debut by Invocator still rules. No, it's not death metal, but it's genuinely awesome. Infamous Swedish label Black Mark Productions put out the original pressing of this one. This is a repress by Hammerheart. How about a classic Death Doom jam from the Netherlands here? So, Asphyx, The Rack. I really hope that you have this debut album from your collection. Definitely a death metal essential. It's no-nonsense riffs for days, right? And the iconic howl of vocalist Martin Van Drunen, who served as the vocalist for Pestilence prior to joining this band, definitely makes that album stand out. Century Media put out the original press. Autopsy, Mental Funeral. Another death metal essential is the sophomore album by American death metal titans, Autopsy. Many would list this among the greatest death metal albums of all time. It's ripe with tempo changes, diverse structures, and the unhinged vocals of drummer Chris Ryford. So the cover artwork by Kevin Walker, also similarly iconic. Kev also did artwork for Warhammer, Magic the Gathering, and Marvel Comics. Peaceful Records put this one out. Malevolent Creation, The Ten Commandments. The debut full-length by Floridian death metal legends Malevolent Creation also came out in 91. RC Records put this one out. Vocalist Brett Hoffman passed away in 2018 from colon cancer, but his vocal approach, was a staple of the Malevolent Creation sound across multiple different eras of the band, and check out his work also with Silent Death, Stone Cold too. His vocals, were still pretty thrashy on this first Malevolent Creation album, but he got a little more guttural after that. Also, it has that great Scott Burns production and a classic cover by Dan Seagrave. Morgoth, Cursed. So here's one last death metal essential for you from '91. The debut full length from Germany's Morgoth came out from Century Media that year as well. The riffs are still ridiculously massive, and the howls of Mark Grew are still pretty awesome. Moving on to 1992, let's start with a deep cut here. Blackthorn, Dawn of Immortality. Mexico's Blackthorn released their Dawn of Immortality demo independently on tape back in April of '92. It's never gotten a standalone CD released, but it has been included as part of a compilation, this one, right, called Final Dawn of Immortality, that includes their '91 demo as well. So I kind of cheated a little bit with this one, since it's kind of a compilation, but it was it's got this kind of taller digipack release here. It was released by Super Alteri et Mortem Invocationists, and of course it was limited to only 666 copies. Necrosanct Incarnate. So the sophomore album from England's Necrosanct came out through Black Mark Productions. They were active from 1989 to 1993, and they put out 3 albums in that time. Solid death metal stuff. Panthymonium, Dawn of Dreams. Dan Swanyo, the man that knows all of the death metal cheat codes, put out the debut album with his avant-garde, keyboard-heavy death metal band Panthymonium in April of '92 through Osmos Productions. Dan used the stage name De Desira for his work in this project and some of his other projects too. Let's get some more Malevolent Creation, but this time a little more death metal. So Malevolent Creation's Retribution. The second full-length from Malevolent Creation is a much more death metal album than their debut for multiple reasons, right? Including the Scott Burns production, the more guttural approach by Brett, the cover art by Dan Seagrave, Rob Barrett on guitars, right, prior to him joining Cannibal Corpse. And this is also the first Malevolent Creation album with Alex Marquez from Solstice, Resurrection, and Demolition Hammer handling the drums. And this even has a guest appearance by James Murphy on it. RC Records put this out. Another old school one here, right? Obituary, The Incomplete. So the third album by Florida's Obituary was released by RC Records. Definitely has those meat and potatoes riffs with Alan West's signature guitar tone, and of course the unmistakable vocals from John Tardy. Frank Watkins, the bassist from Hellwitch and Gorgoroth, played on this and many other Obituary albums before he passed away in 2015 following a battle with cancer. This is another album that has that great Scott Burns production. Now, let's move on to 1993, starting with Bigotry, Step to the Grave. Here's a raw death metal demo out of the Czech Republic from Bigotry, a band active from 1989 to 1993 until they changed their name to Dissolving of Prodigy, which is the name they continued to use until they split up in 2013. Originally only self-released on tape, but it received a CD reissue for the 30th anniversary back in 2023, of course. Necrolatry, Dead and Buried. Here's a really sick demo out of Michigan that was originally self-released on tape in '93. In 2014, it was reissued on compact disc by Dark Blasphemies Records. It's an amazing demo. I highly recommend that you check that one out. Unfortunately, we have another Pungent Stench album coming up here next, and it is certainly one of the album covers of all time. And for some reason, right, as if seeing this isn't enough, just having one pressing of it, I also have a second pressing of it, and also, unfortunately, a third pressing of Dirty Rhymes and Psychotronic Beats. So please send help. Let's move on as quickly as we can. Here's a classic, Resurrection, Embalmed Existence. Definitely an underrated gem here. Some great Seagrave art. But Floridian death metal gem doesn't get as much praise as it should, despite having that great Seagrave artwork. Mix from Scott Burns, mastering from Jim Morris of Morrisound, and also the drummer from Malevolent Creations on there. It's well worth checking out if for some reason you haven't heard that album yet. Therion, Symphony Masses, No Dracon Ho Megas. Probably not saying that right. Either Mega Hose, I don't know. Therion released their third full-length album through Mega Rock Records. They were still a death metal band at this point, but they definitely had a lot of symphonics they were bringing into their sound then. And not long after that, they completely abandoned death metal and became a operatic symphonic metal band. But yeah, still at this point, still a death metal band. Still worth checking this one out. Vehement Thrower, I Come in Peace. Here's a pretty deep cut for you. So this was the only full-length release from Poland's Vehement Thrower, which was released on tape by Baron Records in '93. It was reissued in every format by Nuclear War Now Records in 2020. So this raw, angry, grindy death metal, it almost feels like war metal, really. So unfortunately, the guitarist and bassist on this album, Grezgors, passed away only 2 years after this album was released, but not before releasing one more album in a spin-off project he just called Vehement. Keeping up with some of this symphonic sort of melody stuff, now let's go on to Crematory's Transmigration album. So this is the debut album by the German death metal band Crematory, not to be confused with the Swedish Crematory. It does have a lot of symphonics, right? But it still embraces an old school sound and mix. Later on, this band would turn into an industrial gothic metal band, not really my jam, but their first few albums, where they were still playing death metal, pretty good, I think. Macabre, Sinister Slaughter. So many death metal bands have written about serial killers, but none have really kind of fetishized them to the extent that Macabre has. So these Illinois natives have written many odes to murder, and even have met some of these serial killers. I'll give you some quick stories. Frontman Lance met notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy 3 times when he was on death row, and he even has some original paintings that John Wayne Gacy had mailed to him. You'll see that the photos aren't what you expect from someone meeting a serial killer, since they took they look a lot more celebratory. Lance also attended Jeffrey Dahmer's trial. Some of the songs from Dahmer, another one of their albums, were written while Lance was writing notes during that trial. Lance did clarify he doesn't want to be friends with those types of people. He just finds them interesting, likes to study them, likes to write lyrics about them, finds them fascinating. Macabre are also one of the earliest death metal bands, having formed in their earliest version as Labyrinth back in 1981, but they were not playing death metal at that time. Sinister Slaughter is their second album, which was put out by Nuclear Blast. It features a cover parody of the Beatles' 1967 cover for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, so you can kind of see that comparing those side to side there. The mix is rough, pretty lo-fi, a little inconsistent, but it's still a fun album, pretty goofy death metal, which pretty much describes most of Macabre's output. Fun band live, too. Disgorge, Espousal Bleeding. So not to be confused with the American and Mexican bands also called Disgorge, right? There's some other ones as well. But Disgorge from Sweden was a band active from 1991 to 1996. In that time, they put out 2 demos, the first of which was the Espousal Bleeding demo here. It was self-released on tape at the time, but finally received a CD pressing thanks to Doom to Obscurity Records in 2022. You probably know this band, but maybe haven't heard this particular album, but Septic Flesh's Mystic Places of Dawn. This Greek symphonic death metal band are now a massive staple of the genre, but their unique mix of Middle Eastern scales, lyrics about mythology, and death metal started with this debut, Mystic Places of Dawn, which was originally released by French label Holy Records. It has since been reissued many times and has been included in a box set available from Season of Mist with alternate artwork. You've heard the name Skeletal Remains, but you know this Skeletal Remains, so Legions of the Undead. So before the popular Californian band Skeletal Remains formed in 2011, there was another American death metal band with that name that were active from 1992 to 2000. Kind of the OG Skeletal Remains, if you will. So they were from Connecticut. This demo was their only release, which was self-released on tape, but in 2024 it was reissued on CD by Doom to Obscurity. It has a nice, raw, mid-paced groove sound. Another great gem here, so Oppressors, Solstice of Oppression. So this is a classic death metal gem out of Chicago. Solstice of Oppression is an early example of a death metal that kind of brings in more of those technical flourishes. The iconic cover is by Sylvain Bellemare, who has also done artwork for Amorphous, Blasphemy, Gutted, Cataclysm, Mortal Skull, Quo Vadis, Rotting Christ, Wombbath, and others. Cannibal Corpse's The Bleeding. We gotta have a couple of their albums in here, right? So the fourth Cannibal Corpse album is among their grooviest and catchiest works. It also has an awesome, warm production and a number of their most celebrated songs, including Stripped, Raped, and Strangled. My personal favorite off this album is The Pickaxe Murderers. The cover art is by their long-running collaborator Vincent Locke, but interestingly, the original press is a zoomed-in section of the cover. So Paul Merkowitz explained this decision to Decibel magazine. He said, "When we saw the full painting, we looked at it as a great piece of art, but it wasn't brutal enough. We tried to add more blood. At the last minute, we couldn't have Vince do another piece, so that's when we said, well, we'll just blow up the midsection of that guy and make it very surreal, like avant-garde." The full cover, as Vincent intended it, wasn't used until about 2006, when Metal Blade started to reissue it on Digipack. But you can still see, even here, when using that it's still zoomed in a bit, and that the logo still obstructed most of the artwork. A little bit later, there were some zoomed out pressings that actually used the full cover. But yeah, there's the story to why that cover stands out as something very different from the rest of the Cannibal Corpse catalog. So when people think of Ghost, they maybe don't think of this band, but hopefully from now on maybe you will. So Ghost, The Lost of Mercy. Not to be confused with the popular Swedish occult rock band Ghost from Poland, were a death metal band active off and on since the 80s. The Lost of Mercy is their first and only full-length album, which was originally released in 1994 by Polish label Loud Out Records. It was reissued by Thrashing Madness Productions, which, just have to mention, probably one of the most underrated record labels. They reissued it in 2014. Thrashing Madness reissued it again in 2022 with a DVD that includes live recordings from 1989 and a bunch of bonus tracks, including their 1998 demo and live tracks that span 93 to 94. Here's another band, right, where the mighty have certainly fallen since then. In Flames, Lunar Strain. Sweden's In Flames might be a terrible metalcore rock band now, but in the early 90s, they were nearly untouchable when it came to melodic death metal. Lunar Strain was their debut album, which was originally released by Wrong Again Records. It has received many reissues since then, including this, right, one of the Japanese presses. We looked at a more obscure band called Disgorge, but now let's go to the one that maybe most people are thinking of first, which is the American Disgorge. So they put out their 1995 demo, and surprise, right, 1995. So Disgorge from California are one of the most celebrated brutal death metal bands ever. They formed in 1992 and released their first demo that year, and then their second demo, right, came out in 1995. It was originally self-released by the band on tape, but was reissued on CD by Indonesian label Underrated Records in 2019. Broken Hope, Repulsive Conception. So the third album from Chicago's Broken Hope was released by Metal Blade Records. It's now a classic death metal album due to, among many other factors, the low guttural vocals of Joe, who tragically killed himself in 2010. He was their frontman from 1988 until 2001. I know what you're thinking, right? Like, I gotta have that D. I got it for you. So Deicide's Once Upon the Cross. This is the third album by Deicide, and it was originally released by Roadrunner Records. The lineup included the Hoffman brothers and was engineered by Scott Burns. It was mastered by George Marino, who also mastered many albums by the likes of Anthrax, Death, Deep Purple, Dio, Dokken, Dream Theater, Iron Maiden, Manowar, Metallica, Motley Crue, Obituary, Ozzy Osbourne, Scorpions, Sepultura, Twisted Sister, and many others. Unfortunately, George passed away from lung cancer in 2012. But yeah, definitely an interesting person to be behind a death metal album there. Ceremonial Oath, Carpet. The second album by Ceremonial Oath is not as celebrated as their first, but it's still an album with some really strong songwriting from one of the earliest Swedish death metal bands. This was far more melodic, It was released by Black Sun Records in 1995 and then reissued by Vic Records in 2020. Mangled Torsos, Godless. Mangled Torsos are a criminally underrated German death metal band that was active from 1991 to 1996. I highly recommend especially their 1994 debut, Drawings of the Dead. But this is their sophomore album, Godless, that has an April anniversary. The vocal approach on this one, it's a lot goofier. The vocals aren't great, gonna be honest here. But if you can get past that, there's some quality stuff in this album. Centinex, Malleus Maleficarum. So the second album by Swedish death metal legend Centinex was originally released by Wild Rags Records, but has been reissued multiple times since then, including by my friends over at Old Shadows Records. Polluted Inheritance, Betrayed. The second album by Dutch technical death metal band Polluted Inheritance might not get as much attention as their first, but this one, it's also a great album too. The band were active from 1989 to 2008. The Dutch label DSFA Records put out the original press, but Vic Records reissued it in 2013. Scabbard, Beginning of Extinction. Beginning of Extinction was the debut album by Scabbard from the Czech Republic. They formed in 1992. They're still active today. This is a goofy name here, so let's see if we can say this together now. Deathvastation put out the original press, but it was reissued by Awakening Records out of China in 2020. The beautiful cover art was painted by Tim White, who created a lot of science fiction artwork from the 70s through the 90s. He passed away in 2020. Crack Up, Blood is Life. This is the debut album by Germany's Crack Up, which was released by German Level Corrosion in April of 1996. It was reissued by German label MDD in 2023. The band would later play a kind of a more death and roll style. Edge of Sanity, Crimson. Years before Sleep and other bands would embrace album-long songs, Dan Swanyo and the rest of Edge of Sanity released their fifth album, Crimson. It was a single-track album that spanned 40 minutes, and it is a masterpiece of musical twists and turns that make a cohesive whole. It includes guest guitar work and vocals by Michael Ackerfeld from Opeth and Bloodbath fame. Dan Swanyo engineered the album himself, and he was one of the key songwriters on the album too. It was originally released by Black Mark, but has been reissued multiple times since then. The autograph on mine is from Dan Swanyo, the legendary musician and engineer that has played a role in countless death metal masterpieces. Getting a little more mainstream with this one, but still a deeper cut within their discography, which is Amon Amarth, Sorrow Throughout the Nine Worlds. The Norse mythology-obsessed Swedish melodic death metal band Amon Amarth are now one of the biggest death metal bands in the world, but when this first EP was released, they were virtually unknown. It was originally released by my friends in Singapore through Pulverized Records, which Pulverized repressed again in 2000. Now Amon Amarth's digestible form of mellow death is widely available worldwide, but this particular gem, right, is still pretty hard to come by. Quo Vadis, Forever. Technical melodic death metal band Quo Vadis are one of the greatest bands to come out of Canada, and during their 1993 to 2010 existence, they put out 3 incredible full lengths and a great live DVD among other releases. Forever was their debut full length, which was released by a label called Vomit that I think pretty much only released the early Quo Vadis material. I think their later 2 albums maybe have the edge on this one, but it's hard for that to not be the case when you bring in people like Steve DiGiorgio to play on some of their later recordings. Dissection, Where Dead Angels Lie. People might argue if Dissection were, Black or Death or a mix of those two, right? But following the back-to-back masterpieces that were The Somber Lane and Storm of the Light's Bane, they released the Where Dead Angels Lie EP through Nuclear Blast Records. It received 3 pressings in 1996, including this one, the shaped disc version. The EP has not been reissued since, but the tracks would later be included as bonus tracks on all the reissues, basically, of Storm of the Light's Bane starting in 2002. Now we're to 1997, kind of an awkward year for death metal, because what was popular out in the rest of the world was nu metal, right? You had bands like Korn really just thriving, and then a lot of death metal bands kind of started to mess with that nu metal sound, and so we're just gonna skip 1997. So now we're at 1998. And I guess a band that definitely didn't have kind of a nu metal phase would be Cannibal Corpse. So this is Gallery of Suicide. Cannibal Corpse released their 6th full-length in 1998, which was their 2nd album featuring Corpse Grinder, who was originally known for Monstrosity. This was their 1st album that included Pat O'Brien as one of their guitarists, who's probably the most technical guitar player they've ever had. Jack Owen continued to serve as the other guitarist, and Alex and Paul continued to hold down bass and drums as always. For me, the instrumental track, From Skin to Liquid, is not only the best song from this album, but one of the best songs that Cannibal Corpse ever wrote. Pat O'Brien wrote the song, and I highly recommend it if you've never heard it before. Long-running Cannibal Corpse partners Metal Blade put this one out. Got some more legends coming your way, so Incantations, Diabolical Conquest. Incantation put out their 4th album in '98, which is still one of their most celebrated albums. It's the only album to feature Daniel Corchado from Mexico's Cenotaph and The Chasm as part of their lineup. Daniel handled most of the guitars, the bass, the vocals, some of the songwriting, and some of the lyrics, so he unquestionably played a role in crafting this gem. It might not come as a surprise that the person responsible for a masterpiece like The Gloomy Reflection of Our Hidden Sorrows and multiple masterpieces from The Chasm also helped elevate this Incantation album to the classic status that it currently holds. The cover art is by Miran Kim, an artist known for work on the X-Files comic series, and who also created the cover art for many of Incantation's early works, including their debut Onward to Golgotha. More legends, Niles amongst the catacombs of Nephron-Ka. The debut by Egypt-obsessed South Carolina natives Nile was released in 1998 by Relapse Records. It was an earth-shattering album for how it introduced Middle Eastern scales and Egypt mythology into metal music, or at least it popularized it in death metal music. A lot of the unique sound of this album comes from the unorthodox instruments used that include thigh-bone flutes, Turkish gongs, Damaru human skull drums, hunting choirs, and dumbecks. This is still an album that stands out as something truly special in death metal's canon, and it may be the best album that Nile ever put out. Death metal really hasn't been the same since this album dropped. More legends coming, so Masters, Faith is in Season. Master are often credited as one of the earliest death metal bands since they formed back in 1983. In modern times, their sound is probably more easily labeled as thrash, but it's easy to see how they were entrenched in the death metal canon, especially following their 2nd album, which included Paul Masvidal from Cynic on guitars, backing vocals from John Tardy from Obituary, guest leads from John Ortega from Morbid Angel, and it was also engineered by Scott Burns. Faith is in the Season is their 4th album. Still a pretty brutal death thrash album in its own right. Now we're going to start getting a little heavier. Dehumanized, Prophecies Foretold. Dehumanized have been a staple of the New York brutal death metal sound ever since the release of their debut, Prophecies Foretold, by Pathos Productions in April of '98. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to Pathos, but Dehumanized brought to the table catchy grooves, memorable songwriting, and some great breakdowns. These are all staples of the New York death metal sound today. The album was reissued by Corpse Gristle Records and Ossuary Records with alternate artwork in 2024. Desecration, Murder in Mind. Somewhat controversial death metalers Desecration from the United Kingdom released their sophomore full-length Murder in Mind in 1998 through UK label Corporal Records. It has a raw, organic, ugly sound that I really enjoy. It was reissued in 2004 with a more provocative artwork. This is that 2004 version. 1999, we've reached the end of the 90s, but we still have a handful more gems to celebrate. Let's start with this demo, Ophiolatri's Opposite Monarchy. The first demo by Brazilian brutal death metal band Ophiolatri came out in April of '99 on cassette through Millennium Records, who also put it out as a split with the Ancient Contradictions demo by their fellow Brazilian death metalers Ancestral Malediction. Later, Ophiolatri would put out two incredible full-lengths that included Anti-Evangelistic Process in 2002 and Transmutation in 2008, and they're about to drop a third full-length album now. Deeds of Flesh, Path of the Weakening. Californian technical brutal death titans Deeds of Flesh released their full length through Unique Leader Records in April of '99. It features cover art by the prolific John Zig and is regarded as a classic by many among the brutal death metal subgenre. Primary vocalist, guitarist, and songwriter Eric Lidmark unfortunately passed away in 2018 following years of difficulty battling sclerosis. But the music is still timeless. God Dethroned, Bloody Blasphemy. The third full-length from Dutch black and death metal band God Dethroned was released by Metal Blade Records. There are big melodeath vibes with this one too. This has been reissued a few times since then as well. Castigate, Bring Me the Head of Jesus Christ. Subtle one, this one. Castigate were a German death grind band active in the 90s. It's a heavy, raw album with some strong performances. This is their only full length, and it was their final release, which was released by System Shock and Pavement Music. Malignancy, Intrauterine Cannibalism. Few bands have established their own sound quite like New York's Malignancy. Their frenzied, pinch harmonic-laced approach to brutal technical death metal has been copied by many, but that largely started right here with their debut full-length. They've been active since 1992, but it wasn't until '99 that they released this full-length album, which was originally through United Guttural Records. It has been reissued multiple times, including a 2019 double disc version by Severed Records that includes the entire album redone alongside a second disc with the original mix. Let's end with a potentially controversial one, shall we? Children of Bodom's Hatebreeder. So, yeah, this might be a little bit controversial for some to call this a death metal album, but it's unquestionable that Finland's Children of Bodom were one of the largest, if you use the term melodic death metal, bands in the genre. Their virtuoso keyboard and guitar work was largely borrowed from power metal, so it was something pretty fresh when this, their second album, was released by Spine Farm Records in April of '99. They also had a unique cover theme that always featured one distinct color, so on this one green, and a depiction of the Grim Reaper. Love them or hate them, the music of Alexi Laiho and co. was an important gateway for many metal fans to get into heavier stuff. So, Children of Bodom was kind of the first step for many people to find death metal. Alexi unfortunately passed away from alcohol-related cirrhosis and pancreatitis in 2020. What's your favorite from this list? Did I leave out your favorite April release? Go ahead and let me know in the comments. See you next time.